Bread. Whether you're carb conscious or carbolicious, bread is versatile, universal, and pretty much good for any occasion. In fact, I don't think I know a single person who doesn't love bread. And frankly, if you're out there, I am not 100% sure that we can be friends. But how many of us make bread? It's one of the simplest recipes out there, and yet most of us go reaching for the bag at the grocery store rather than make our own. Part of that could be convenience, but another part could be inexperience. I mean, is homemade bread really better than the stuff you buy at the store? How long does it take? And when can I eat it? That's up next on Fact Bites. And hey, if you like today's content, make sure you like and subscribe for more hot, fresh fact bites. Bread is so simple to make, and the ingredients are basic staples that everyone probably has in their house already. Any recipe you find, whether it's naan or French bread, requires 5 basic ingredients: flour, sugar, salt, yeast, and water. There may be a few add-ins here and there, but your basic loaf of bread, just these 5. Let's break these ingredients down. What is it that they're doing? Well, flour provides the bulk of your bread content and also your bread structure. You've probably heard about gluten / know someone who is gluten intolerant. That's a real problem because gluten, or the proteins found in wheat and wheat products, is what gives bread its texture. High gluten content makes a firmer, chewier bread, and low gluten content makes for an airier, fluffier bread. You can actually buy flours based on their gluten content. All-purpose flour contains about 10% gluten and can be used for literally anything. It's in the name. Bread flour has a higher gluten content, roughly around 12%, and can be used for basic bread, but also bagels, soft pretzels, anything that's characterized by a dense crumb and a chewy texture. If you see cake flour or pastry flour, on the other hand, these both have lower gluten content. There are a lot of substitutes out there for wheat flour, and you can get some pretty good results, but you'll never end up with a chewy bagel without the formation of gluten proteins. So when you're making the perfect loaf of bread, ask yourself, is this going to be dense and chewy or light and fluffy? Today, I am making a European-style loaf of just plain white bread, and I am using all-purpose flour because that is what I have in my kitchen. Next up, let's talk yeast and sugar. Why do these two go together? Well, because yeast is alive and feeds on sugar. Yeast is a leavening agent. It's what causes bread dough to rise or prove on the counter, and it also makes the bread rise when it's baking in the oven. Yeast eats sugar and releases carbon dioxide, which is what causes the bread to rise. When it's in the oven, the gluten structures in the bread start to solidify and trap the carbon dioxide into air bubbles. The smaller the air bubble, the finer the crumb and the denser the bread. So here's the thing about yeast. There are many different types, and there are 2 main ones that we use in baking. There is instant yeast, and then there is active dry yeast. Now, instant yeast you can use instantly. It says it right there in the name. Just open your packet and pour it into your flour mixture. Active dry yeast requires a little bit more effort. Now, remember how I said that yeast was alive? Well, active dry yeast is normally dormant, and you have to wake it up before you use it. Here's how that works. Measure out the water called for in your recipe and gently heat it to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Add the required amount of sugar, then stir in your yeast and let it sit. The yeast will begin to absorb the water and sugar and release carbon dioxide, creating a foamy head on your liquid mixture. Once the foam forms, it's good to pour into the rest of your dry ingredients. Finally, we have salt. Now, why is salt important? Tell me, friend, do you like flavor? Salt is important to the yeast as well. Yeast ingests salt the same way that it does sugar, although too much of either and you'll kill the yeast. However, more importantly, the taste of plain flour is, well, it's bland, it's flour. So salt is super important for your bread to taste right. There is nothing worse than a well-baked loaf of bread fresh from the oven that tastes like cardboard. All right, so now I'm gonna add in my water, sugar, and yeast. And for this bit, you really just want it to come together. All right, now let's talk about the non-ingredients that go into making the perfect loaf. First up, let's talk about kneading. Water activates the particles in flour that turn into gluten. Kneading makes sure that the water is evenly distributed throughout the flour and then helps those gluten structures to form. This is what makes dough elastic and springy. This is also what makes bread delicious and chewy. Be careful to follow the recipe's instructions for kneading. Too much kneading and you may go way past chewy and into lead. All right, let's talk about time. No matter what type of bread you're making or the yeast you're using, there will be a given amount of proving that needs to happen. Now, proving is just essentially letting your yeast sit and spit out carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide turns into air bubbles, which are so important to texture. Some recipes will have a short proof time, others will have multiple proof times. Follow your proof. Temperature. Remember how I said you should have warm water to activate your yeast? Well, that's because yeast is dormant when it's cold. In general, the warmer your baking area, the faster your yeast will activate. So the less proof time you'll need, and obviously the less cook time if your oven's hotter. Pay attention to the temperatures that you need for cooking, but also pay attention to the temperature in your workspace. If you let your bread overproof, this will weaken the structure of the gluten, thus weakening the structure of your bread. We're gonna fold this back on itself, kind of like a business letter. And then we're gonna use the heel of our hand again to smush it together. And then we're gonna roll it into a log. So next steps. I have a baking tray here already prepped. This has parchment paper and a little bit of cornmeal just to help keep the bread from sticking to the tray, but you don't need these things. The cornmeal also helps to create a crusty bottom on the bread. So I am just going to lay both of my logs here. And then I am gonna cover these with some more plastic wrap. I'm gonna oil it just a little bit. So I have my lightly oiled plastic wrap that I am just going to gently place, and then that will sit for about 45 minutes. All right. And here's a good test to determine if your bread is ready to bake. If you poke it with your finger and the indent remains, then you are good to go. So here's a few things you can do just to make your bread a little more, visually pleasing. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dust a little bit of flour over the top. I'm also going to put some slashes in my bread. Now this serves dual purposes. Number one, it's just gonna make your bread look prettier, but more importantly, number two, it's creating steam vents. Now, steam's gonna get out of your bread anyway, and the steam will either make its own vent or you can give it a vent by doing these slashes. This way it's not gonna come out of the sides and you're not gonna end up with weird crackles, and it's gonna be a very nicely formed loaf of bread. All right, so our oven is set for 450 degrees. So we're gonna go ahead and put this in the oven now. Did you know that you can check bread's doneness like you'd check a steak on the grill? When bread is fully cooked, it should read 190 degrees Fahrenheit on a kitchen thermometer. It's a little different if you've added any enriching agents, that's butter, milk, and eggs, but for your basic bread recipe, you want it to hit 190. That way, you don't slice into the middle and hit raw dough. Finally, we talked about time during the dough making process. Now we're going to talk about time again. Fresh bread hot out of the oven is so tempting. It smells so good and it's warm and the butter will melt immediately, and so you want to slice into it right away. Stop what you're doing. Do not waste that loaf. Bread fresh out of the oven is still technically cooking from the inside out. You need to allow that cooking process to finish so that the starches can solidify. Have you ever noticed that when you cut into fresh hot bread, the bread itself gets sticky and smushes together? That's because the starches have not firmed up or gelatinized yet. Here's a few other things that happen when you slice into bread too quickly. You release all the steam from the bread. This will dry bread out faster, so it won't last as long. You're also digging into the bread before the flavor has fully developed, so the bread you eat immediately out of the oven actually doesn't taste as good as the bread that has fully cooled on your countertop. And there you have it, our rustic European loaves. They spent 20 minutes in the oven. I showed you how to check the internal temperature, 190. You'll notice that our steam vents kind of closed up on themselves, so we did get a little bit of steam venting out of the sides, but that's fine. It's still gonna taste great. And they are warm and brown, and we are going to let them sit, even though we really like to cut right into these immediately. We are gonna let them sit, cool down to room temperature before we slice into them. But I can tell you from experience that they are going to be delicious. And that's the basics of bread making. It's not a difficult process, but it does take time and patience, something that you might have in abundance right now, or something that you're trying to work on. Trust me when I tell you it is well worth the effort. Got any tips that I missed? Or tell us your favorite bread recipe in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.